Not many of us have heard the name Eutychus outside of the Bible. Eutychus is an individual that we read of in the book of Acts chapter 20, and we read about this young man who was listening to Paul as Paul spoke on and well into the night. And we remember Eutychus because he was the young fellow who was in the windowsill listening, and he fell out of the window, fell asleep, fell out of the window, and he died. And of course, thankfully, Paul went out and he raised him from the dead and brought him back to his family, and there was a lot of joy that evening. But when you think about Eutychus, one of the first things we think about and we're reminded of when we hear that name is probably the story that he's the young guy that fell asleep in the window. And that's what he's remembered for. Eutychus isn't remembered for the young man who was one of only a few in the scriptures who was raised from the dead. And people got to ask him, what happened and what was that like? Or Eutychus wasn't remembered for being, one of the first maybe in the youth group. In the church at that time. He was a young man, and he wasn't remembered necessarily for his dedication. He had been willing to go and to listen to Paul as Paul preached on and on late into the night. He was there. We don't remember Eutychus for any of those things necessarily. Some of us might, but many of us just remember that he was the young guy that fell out of the window and died and was raised from the dead. Now, we don't know, maybe Paul's preaching, and that's why Paul was preaching late into the night. He was tired, maybe he had an exhausting day. We don't know all the details to what happened. I mean, no one hooked him up to see what his sleep patterns were like and how much or lack of sleep that he had. But maybe there was something there. Maybe there was something to it. Maybe it wasn't just Paul's preaching. Some people, that happens. We get bored. Maybe some have already fast-forwarded this part of the lesson. But Eutychus, maybe there was something happening with his sleep. Researchers now have spent so much time and there's so much money dedicated into the research around our sleep patterns. They're saying that, on average, we need to get between 7 and 8 hours sleep or more for some individuals. It depends on age. And there's a lot of things that can happen if you're not getting your proper sleep. And just the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in 2016, so this is about 4 years old, but these are the things that you have an increased chance of getting or having if you have lack of sleep. Stroke, arthritis, asthma, depression, diabetes, and cancer or heart attack. These are all some things that are affected by our sleep or lack of. And we see that the statistics say if you get less than 6 hours a night of sleep, that there's about a 10% higher mortality rate or death rate. And for those who are getting less than 7 but more than 6, they say it's about a 4%. And so they're really saying sleep is so important. Almost 20% of accidents, of car accidents, are accredited to sleepiness. And some surveys say that adults, depending on the age group, but usually between 40 and 60 years old in that range, that they're not getting the proper sleep, and 40% of them have admitted to falling asleep within the past 30 days at work. And it's just showing that there's a lack of sleep and problems. With sleep-related products, in 2015, there was an article in 2017 that said the industry was $41 billion industry, and they projected that by this year, 2020, it would increase to $52 billion. And in actual fact, they believe it's more like $67 billion this year. And they're projecting that in the next 5 years, it'll be a $114 billion industry. And so we spend a lot of time looking at the importance of our sleep on our bodies. Experts are saying, there's some things, if you want a good sleep, you want to be more aware. If you get a good sleep, first of all, it can affect us with our grades, better grades, less stress levels, fewer accidents and mistakes made at the workplace, better decision making, and even better impulse control. So those are a few of the things that are related to having a good night's sleep. And so they're saying if you want a good night's sleep, don't eat a large meal before bed, make sure you have the right temperatures and a good environment. But one of the things they say is put your devices down. Don't keep your device in your room. Next to sleep, probably the next thing that's really causing a problem for us and interrupting our rest pattern is, and sleeping rest, as we're talking about, is that of our phones, of always being connected. Today, more than ever, our phones are there, and we just feel this need to be on our phones at all times. We don't even really know what to be bored. We don't know what boredom is anymore. You just have to look, when you go to get your car fixed, maybe you're sitting in the mechanics and maybe the getting your oil changed, and you're sitting in the waiting room there, and nobody's talking to each other. Everyone's on their device. Or if you're in line to get into a store, everyone's on your device. When you're on the bus outside of COVID, people are at the bus stop. You're on your device. We're constantly on our devices. We pick our devices up, and we almost feel like, and this is again this talking about all these studies and the problem area in life. Addictions to our cell phones and the problems we have with our cell phones, that's rising, and that's becoming something that's a serious problem. The American Addiction Center, resources for the American Addiction Centers, they're giving all kinds of resources on self-treatment for cell phone addiction, smartphone addiction therapy, treatment groups for cell phone addiction. This is something on the horizon that's more and more, because especially during COVID, this is something that's really gotten into our lives. And you're going to see in a minute when we come back and we bring all this back to the Scriptures, how this affects our spiritual lives as well. But the fact that we're always on our phones, and we use our phones at night. And this is the thing, it's hard. Some of us, we want a good night's sleep, but our phones are there. We need our phones, right? It's our alarm. For some of us, maybe we play songs to get to sleep, or for our kids, lullabies. And maybe on our phones, we have sleep tracking apps. And so we already know the problems, and there's just articles, it seems like every second or third week or month that come out regarding, the blue light problems and our brain waves and all these other things that are affecting us, or the blue light waves affecting our brains. And more of us are working from home and now always on. People can't separate their work from their home lives, and how it's interrupting. Phones are becoming more important than family and relationships. And people have this urgency to always be on. It's interesting. This week on Wednesday, I had someone that within 1 hour contacted me 18 times, phoned 18 times. I was in a meeting, and I just kept, hitting, decline call. And finally, this is the message. Hi, Jamie. Call me now. I have to ask you something ASAP. Even though, I wasn't worried about it, and I got back to them the next day. But some of us, that's what we feel, right? Is that this, did they read the email I sent, or it shows that they've read this message. Why aren't they responding? And we're wondering if we said something wrong, or maybe we're on the other side of that. And they need to know right now, how long will they wait for an answer? And these are all the issues that just this one little device is causing. And the phone, the problem, there's this term that came out in 2010 that was coined a technology Sabbath. The problem is not our technology, though. It's how we use it, or how we're not able to control our use of it. It's kind of like sugar. Sugar's not a problem. The problem with sugar is that we're addicted to it, and we put it in everything. And so with our phones, or it doesn't have to be a phone, it can be a lot of these things in life that are distracting us, that are keeping us away from rest. And maybe some say, well, the phone is a time of rest for me. But we're not talking about, just a time of sitting down and being on your phone and mindlessly scrolling. I want to talk about this morning, we're in Core 52 in the subject of rest, of Sabbath rest. Rest with God. Because that's what the Sabbath was about. The Sabbath was really, you got to look behind it. It wasn't just a day that God said, I'm going to give you a day that you're not supposed to do any work, and I'm just going to test you that day to see if you don't do any work. That's not what the point of the Sabbath was. Sabbath means a rest, to cease, to stop. And it was the first time that we see this Sabbath, where we see that God blessed the seventh day in Genesis, and he blessed it and he made it holy. But the first time we see God kind of enforcing this is when, just after the Israelites came out of Egypt. In Egypt, they didn't know rest. They were slaves in Egypt. And they were crying out to God constantly. And God brings them out of Egypt through Moses, and he sends Moses, and they come out and they're in the wilderness. God did not intend for them to be in the wilderness for 40 years. If they had followed and listened to him and were obedient, they would have understood rest differently. But they didn't. They failed. They sent the spies in, and that's a whole other story. And so they were there 40 years. And during that time in the wilderness, God still provided for them. He gave them manna. And in Exodus chapter 16, they have this manna, and God says on the sixth day, you collect manna, but on the seventh day, you're not going to do that. And there will be enough. And they were surprised that on the seventh day, that the manna they had collected and saved till the seventh day, it didn't rot, didn't get maggots, it didn't stink. It was fine. They didn't have refrigerators or freezers. They just kept this aside, and it was fine. And so this is before God gave the Sabbath as one of the 10 Commandments to keep that Sabbath day. This is in Exodus chapter 16, 21 through 26. You can read about it in that section. You see, God was trying to teach them something about rest. Because Moses brought them out, and God's trying to say, look, I'm trying to show you that I'm trying to give you rest. Have a relationship with me. Follow me. Obey my commands, and you will understand rest like you've never understood it before. As a matter of fact, then in Exodus chapter 20, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, one of the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy, you're to labor 6 days do your work, but on the seventh day is to be a Sabbath, but not just Sabbath and that's it. It's not just to be a rest day, a Sabbath to the Lord. And that's the point we often miss. You see, it's not just you take a rest day and you put all your things down. It's what you bring into your life. It's bringing in that relationship with God. Bringing in those moments of peace and those moments of just listening and meditating and talking to God. Bringing in that relationship, a deeper relationship, and focusing on God. That's what's behind the Sabbath. And that's why Jesus, in Mark chapter 2, we read of Jesus, Jesus says in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 28, he says, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. You know, he's trying to teach them something new, that this was a blessing from God. The Sabbath day was to be a blessing. But humanity never really understood that. It became more about the rule. It's more important to follow the rule. As a matter of fact, even today, you know, some of the Jews, they wrestle with some of the things that you're allowed to do on Sabbath. And that's, you know, there was a few general principles, you know, or there's some things, general categories that they could do and not do on Sabbath, things that they were supposed to do, or not supposed to do. And, you know, the Jews wrestle with that. You know, how far can we walk on the Sabbath? You'll read, for example, in Acts chapter 1, you see that they were the Mount of Olives being a Sabbath day's walk from Jerusalem. Now, that doesn't mean they were, you know, a whole day's walk away. On the Sabbath, they were only allowed to walk so far. And if you're on the Mount of Olives, you can see there's the city's right there. I mean, there's the temple, it's right across. Just go down a valley and up and you're there. And so it's a Sabbath day's walk is how far they were allowed to walk on the Sabbath day. And some of the Jews, you know, they were just focused on this rule, on following the day. And so they would say, well, if this is my home, my dwelling, you know, I'll make another part of my dwelling so far away, and then I can go beyond that. And, you know, you keep, you know, making your dwelling place or a part of your dwelling on your property so you could go out and, you know, check on your fields or do whatever it is you wanted to do. And they missed the whole point of the Sabbath. There are some rules that even we kind of say, you know, we kind of look at this and say that doesn't really make sense. For example, you know, if you can't climb a tree on the Sabbath because if you break a branch off, you know, that could be sowing. If, you know, fruit gets on the ground and the seeds and it causes further plants to grow. Or you can't cut your hair or your nails because that could be shearing. You can't braid your hair because that could be weaving. And, you know, get all these technicalities. And even today, some of the Jews are like, can we even pick up a phone? Are we allowed to? And there's some debate about that. And so the rabbis had a real challenge with trying to figure out what you're allowed to do and not do. And Jesus, he challenged them on many occasions. He tried to get them to see and to understand what's behind the Sabbath. And if you have your Bibles with you, you can look in Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 12, here is Jesus with his disciples, and they're picking some grain, some heads of grain from the field. And they're caught, because this is a Sabbath day, and they're hungry. And verse 2, when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. And of course, Jesus refers to something that David did that was not lawful when David was hungry. David was on the run from Saul, and he went in and he took from the tabernacle, and he took some of the bread that was for the priests only. He's not supposed to do that. And Jesus, you know, he kind of points to behind it. And then this is recorded in, I believe this is in Mark, where there's a reference to Jesus saying, you know, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Go and learn what this means. You know, Sacrifice is something you see. Mercy is something that comes from inside. You can't always see it. Jesus is pointing to the heart. What's the heart? What's the point of the Sabbath? And so with the Sabbath, God is trying to get us to understand it's not just a day where we're taking a break and ceasing from all of the work that we're doing. This is a day that we're growing a stronger relationship with God. It was meant to be a blessing to the people. As God's people came out of slavery, and Moses didn't end up giving them rest. They were wandering 40 years. And then Joshua, the Hebrew writer talks about this. Joshua brings them into the promised land. And in that promised land, they could have found rest. It would have been so good for them. And even in God's law, not just the seventh day of the week where they have this rest. And this rest wasn't just to be for them. It was to be for their slaves, for everyone. But the land was also given rest. Every 7 years, you weren't to work the land. And of course, every 7 years, every 49, there's an announcement of the year of Jubilee where you get your land back and there's freedom and there's a great blessing to come. This rest comes in a different way. And so trying to understand what rest means. And you go back and you look at God, and God creates, and you see in 6 days, and then on the seventh day, God blesses it and it's holy. God's done the work of creation. And then there's this rest that humanity has with God. There is Adam and Eve in this garden, and they have this beautiful relationship with God, and there's no hindrance of sin. And that's what the Sabbath should be pointing to, is when they follow God and they understand this is the true rest that God is offering them. Yes, there's a physical rest and an emotional rest and mental, but what God is truly pointing to is the spiritual rest that comes with the Sabbath. It may be difficult to understand because maybe like money, it's easy when God, talking about tithing, when they're told, how much do we need to tithe? 10%? Great, we'll just do it. That's easy. But you come to the New Testament and all of a sudden, there's this pointing to the heart. How much do we need to give? And, something that's said in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. The person who sows sparingly will reap sparingly, and the one who sows generously will reap generously. Each person should do as he had decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. You see, there's the point behind the giving. There's a purpose to it. God doesn't need your money. The point isn't that, bring all this money into God's temple so God will have enough money to do some upgrades on the temple. And that wasn't the point of tithing. God's looking at the heart and looking at everything that can be done with that. So where's our heart in the Sabbath? Where's our heart in taking that time to put down our phones, to put down all these things around us that distract us from our relationship with God? Jesus says in Matthew 11, just before that chapter on the Sabbath, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke and learn from me, because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And I don't think that that's a mistake, that Matthew has that there right before he talks about this encounter that they had about this Sabbath day. In the Sabbath, taking a time of rest, that's a blessing from God. It's good for us physically. We talked about that, and you can look at, as a matter of fact, there's all kinds of more information. I didn't even get into half the studies that are out there on the importance of rest. There's a couple more studies in June of this year, Harvard Business Review. There's an article saying, managers, encourage your team to take time off. Research shows the benefits of vacation for employees increases productivity, and it adds to the economy. And there's study upon study that's been done about the importance of people taking their rest time, being able to rest. There's a book, The Happiness Advantage, where Sean Aker, he refers to some of the research that's been done and some of the increase in productivity and the amount of mistakes and the creativity that's done when people are happy, when the brain has had that time to be positive. And this is a quote from the book. When the brain can think positively, productivity improves 31%, sales increase 37%, and creativity and revenues can triple. And so there's this push for many companies, to put these rooms where, workers can take naps and make sure they're getting their proper rest, and just making sure that workers are happy because they're understanding the value of physical rest. God made us need that. We need physical rest, even when it comes to something like sleep. In 2015, a 32-year-old died. He'd been up for 3 days straight gaming, and he had a cardiac arrest. Another young 17-year-old, same thing. He was up gaming for many, many days, and the father came in and found that he had died. He hadn't had his proper amount of sleep. God designed us to sleep. We all need sleep. Do you ever think God's designed us to have rest? And this rest, the part of the design, isn't talking about, have my time for, go and play sports and everything. This is filling that time with the relationship with God. Jesus talks about in prayer. Go and find a quiet place to pray. Jesus set an example. He often went off to quiet places to pray when it was still dark. Do we put our stuff down? Do we take enough time in our lives to go and to take some quiet time with God? Do we realize that when Elijah, he went out to look for God, and God sends this whirlwind and this fire and this earthquake, and it wasn't in any of those that he found God, but it was a gentle whisper. The psalmist says, "Be silent before the Lord and wait expectantly for him." Joshua reminds us that in Joshua 1, the book of instruction must not depart from your mouth, and you are to meditate on it day and night. Do you ever take time to meditate on God's word? And just be still and to take some time to talk to God, to listen to God. Take some time to be creative, to think and think about what your purpose is and how you're in your life's direction. A Sabbath was a physical rest, an emotional rest. It's a good recharge for us. It's not something that we have to do, but it's good for us to take that physical and that day of rest. But what's more important is that spiritual rest. So Moses leads them out of slavery. They don't find rest. Joshua leads them into the promised land, and they failed to follow God, and they didn't find that rest. And the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 4 says this, 1 through 10 approximately. "Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest remains, let us beware that none of you have been found to fall short of it. For we also have received the good news just as they did, but the message they heard did not benefit them, since they were not united with those who heard in faith." And then in verse 8, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. Therefore, a Sabbath rest remains for God's people." A Sabbath rest remains. They were still under sin. They were still under this burden of sin, and they saw what sin had done to them and how sin, they never were free. They never were truly free. Even at the height of their nation under Solomon or David, sin was still there as a burden for them. We're not following Moses or Joshua into a promised land. We're following Jesus. And he has offered us true rest, spiritual rest, rest that only we can find is when we come to him and we cast our burdens on him and take his yoke upon us. And that's the rest that God is offering to us. A rest that we can find now, but more that's to come when he returns. And the only way that we will understand that and grow in that is if we're actually taking time to grow our relationship and take a little bit of that principle of the Sabbath that God offers to his people. To grow ourselves in our relationship with God. And to remember that while we're working to grow ourselves spiritually, while we're working hand in hand with Jesus as his co-workers and reaching others to offer them this rest that has been offered to us, this Sabbath rest, an eternal rest, that God has offered us just this understanding to be able to grow. There's a story to be able to grow closer to him. There's a story I'll end with, and this is a challenge of two woodcutters. There was a wood chopping competition. And there's these two woodcutters, and the challenger worked very hard, stopping only for a brief lunch break. But the other man, he had leisurely taken his lunch and some breaks throughout the day, and it didn't seem like he was working as hard. taking all these breaks. And at the end of the day, the challenger was so surprised to see that the man who had taken more breaks had cut more wood. And he said, how is this possible? Every time I looked over, I was working harder than you. I was the one that took a brief break and I just nonstop work. And the other man said, look, every time I took a little bit of a rest, I was sharpening my axe. You know, maybe it's time that we take a look at the principle of the Sabbath day. We take a look at what the Jews were given, what God's people were given as a principle to follow. And that they misunderstood. They just followed it as, this is a law that we have to follow, and not understanding the principle behind it. Where Jesus helps us to understand that the Sabbath is a blessing to us. And may we understand that that Sabbath is a blessing only if we take that time to grow our relationship with God, to be still, to listen, to pray, to read, to meditate on His Word. And then we'll find ourselves with sharp axes as we go out into the harvest field and try and reach and share with others the good news that is only in Jesus that we will find true rest and will be taken into the promised land.